Okay, so to kick off, our first presentation is from Jeremy Brackpool. He's a local climate science expert and trainer, as well as a carbon mitigation advisor. So he'll be doing the first presentation. I'll hand you over to Jeremy now.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Can everyone hear me? Put it on, put it on. Okay, how's that? Ooh, a bit louder. Save me from shouting. So I didn't know quite, you know, when you go out at the moment, you're like, how many layers am I going to wear? Because it's quite cold in my house, right? So it's quite cold outside, but is it going to be warm here? I don't know, how are you finding it? I'm looking around, there's a few coats and a few jumpers, and I've gone for t-shirt and shirt, but I'm up here presenting, so I'm probably a bit warmer than everyone else, to be honest with you. But I'm here today to talk about the climate aspects and to really try and set the scene for the climate side of things. So, of course, there's many reasons why we want our homes to be more efficient and to use less energy. Obviously, it can make it more comfortable. It can, of course, reduce your bills, but the climate is another benefit. But I would like to also put the home aspect of climate change in the context of climate change in general and talk a bit about how it all fits together. I've got on the slide here behind me, I'm going to have to resist the urge to turn around and look at it, but it is there, isn't it? I've got on the slide behind here a link to a website that I've set up, which is called Together on Climate. So this has come about because I speak to a lot of people locally, and often the same sorts of questions come up about climate change. And after a while of writing out the same emails back to people and having the same conversations, I was like, actually, I've put this on the website for you to have a look at. So this is really trying to make it as easy as possible for people to get advice and to understand what's happening. I'll put the link back up at the end if you don't catch it now. Now, I'll kind of go into climate change a little bit on the science, but only a tiny bit. And I really want to focus on actually what impact it has and how to fix it mostly. So I suspect everyone's really aware of how it works. So you have greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide and methane, that go up into the atmosphere, and we're putting them up there as humans. And more of those are going up into the atmosphere every year, and that essentially is creating more and more climate change. So I said I wasn't going to cover much science. Like, that's the level at which I want to go through, like, how climate change works, because I think people probably understand that to that extent already. But when we talk about the climate, it's not the climate, of course, that we should care about because it's the climate, but it's the effect that it has on us and the things that we care about that matter. So I'm going to start us off, hopefully if the technology works, fingers crossed we haven't tested this, I'm going to start us off with trying to get your thoughts on this topic first. So for those of you who have phones, who have smartphones, if you'd like to get them out, ooh, working so far. So you see at the top of the slide up there, there's a website link, menti.com. So if for those of you who want to do it, you go to your phones and you go to that website, and it will prompt you to put in a code. Now it's not collecting your personal data or anything like that. It just will ask you for some information, and what you put in a minute in answer to this question will appear on the screen. So no rude words if you can resist the temptation. It is anonymous, so I won't know who it was. So the first question is really about what is it that actually worries you about climate change? So you can put in a couple of different things, one or two, it's up to you. There's a 25 character limit, so you can't just type a very long sentence. Just like a word or two will really do it. And hopefully, if the internet connection is strong enough, people will, that's quite an interesting one to start with. You never know what's going to come up, right? It will start appearing behind us on the screen. And I like this bit because the rest of it I know what I'm going to say, and this is the bit that I don't know what's going to happen. So I can tell I'm speaking to a pretty informed audience straight away, because I think there's certainly a fair few people here who get the magnitude of what's going on. And I don't think I've read all of them, but I can certainly say I would agree with everything I've read so far. It's pretty serious, and people come at it, as you can probably see from different angles, and there are different aspects of this. And I think there's a piece about kind of the human impact, and there's a piece about the kind of natural world generally. I tend to find that nearly everybody is worried about the human impact, and some people are also worried about the natural world impact on top. And what I would like to talk to you a bit about is some of the science of actually what it's telling us about climate change. And scientists create these kind of very intricate and detailed models trying to understand the climate and looking at actually what happens if we do certain things to do with greenhouse gases, what happens if we put more in, what happens to the climate, what happens to the weather, and how will that feel. So because of these scenarios, you can kind of map out these different ideas. And there's one idea that's kind of explored in these models. And just to kind of simplify it, the idea is something like, as individuals, we take a back seat and we let government get on with what they said they will do. So essentially, it's like governments deliver on all the commitments that they've said on all the policies they've said they're going to do around the climate, and individuals kind of just go along for the ride. And what I would like to do is describe a bit about how that scenario would play out around the year 2050. And it's so hard with the climate talking about these distant dates. So if you can go along with me for a second, I want to kind of take you on a bit of a kind of exploration of thinking about 2050, because it's hard to imagine that far. So I'd like you to think about a young person who's important to you and just kind of roughly work out in your mind what age will they be by 2050. It's about 25 years in the future, if you want to make your maths easy. 30, if you want to make it easier. If you've got a particular person in mind and you've thought about that person, for most people, I suspect they would have probably been that age already. I don't know, there might be some younger people here who haven't quite got to that age, but remember yourself at that age and think about actually what that was like for you when you were that age that they would be in that time. Because when I talk about what it's going to be like, I find it very helpful. I've got kids, I do this myself, to think about them in this situation when it gets to it rather than me. And this is just part of what's happening that I want to kind of draw in on. Could we flip back to the slides? Let's see if we've got this. Oh, this is smooth. Okay, good. So let's flick on a slide. Oh, well, okay, I'm the weak link here, clearly. There's an on button. Right, here we go. So this is quite an interesting map that shows you, I think, very nicely at a glance, kind of what is potentially happening in 2050 under the scenario that I talked about. So you can kind of see that the people who are most affected directly are those living near the equator. And really some of the real fundamentals of what we need as people to live are starting to be really disrupted. And you can all read the key down at the bottom there. But I just kind of want to summarize a bit really what's happening here and bring it to life. So hopefully if it works. The first thing is there's a lot of areas of extreme heat near the equator, and it is really extreme heat. It's not the UK heat wave of last summer, which was unpleasant. It's heat you can't live in. There's real problems for fresh water, including things like glaciers, and that causes farmland issues. There's really big areas of farmland that start to essentially turn to dust that can't be farmed. If you're a community that relies on the sea for your food, the sea's getting quite acidic by this point. It starts to break down the bottom of the food chain. The animals with the little shells struggle to actually live in that sea. So their food and livelihoods start to go. If you're in a coastal city, which a lot of the world is, they start to become quite regularly flooded. And of course, it's where a lot of the rainforests are of the world. And this is a really hard bit of science to understand, but there's a real worry that some of the rainforests like the Amazon switch to savanna instead, and you lose that entire ecosystem. That's the kind of environment that we live in. What that means for people, though, is, of course, actually some areas of the world just aren't inhabitable anymore. Now, there's various models, and the models all seem to suggest that it would create hundreds of millions of refugees. Some suggest it would create over 1 billion climate refugees. And so that would be instantly, undoubtedly, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, 1 in 10 human beings affected by that, and loads more by the reverberations of what that causes. And of course, we know that when you get refugees, you get increase in domestic violence, in harassment, in sexual violence, in trafficking, all those things as well. The war was the first word that came up on the screen we saw before. I mean, it's quite interesting to think about where those refugees are coming from. The 2 countries that actually have the highest number predicted refugees would be Pakistan and Iran. And if you're into your world politics, you'll know that they're not necessarily the places you'd want to be destabilized. They're both nuclear states, for example. Also on the diagram, there's arrows on this, and they show where those people mostly go. So a lot of people end up trying to get towards Europe. Don't forget, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people here. And we kind of know, again, what happens in that situation. So if you go back to 2015, you had about 1 million people crossing in from Syria. And that had a real impact on the politics of Europe. So you got the rise of far-right groups in Austria, Germany. Italy currently has a government that's far-right as well. And their message is always a refugee one, and stopping migration. The other thing, of course, that this all causes, which we're all experiencing at the moment, is impact on cost of living at the bottom there. So you can't have this level of disruption without an impact on how the economy all fits together. We're a global economy, we're part of that. The current cost of living crisis, actually, one of the causes of that is already climate change, even at the current relatively lower levels. There's evidence that hurricanes that have been caused mainly by climate change have damaged infrastructure, storms have closed factories, there's drought affecting harvests in various places. So this is yet another thing that would cause a recurrence of these type of cost of living crises. And it would only step up as well. Now, none of this is to say we wake up one morning and this all just suddenly happens, right? I want to be really clear about this. This is a very gradual thing that just gets harder and harder and harder. And what I really think the consequence of this is that whatever else you want to kind of achieve in the world, if you're somebody who really believes in inequality or rights for certain groups or animal welfare or whatever it happens to be, it's just going to make it so much harder to achieve what you want to achieve, this underlying level of disruption, and will make the world just less safe and probably less equal and fair in the process. So the climate really feels like this very abstract thing, but it actually underpins everything for us as a species. So really, whatever your dreams and your hopes for the future, they probably they'll be very hard to come true unless you're also addressing climate change. So it's this really underpinning piece. But the good news is that there are all the solutions out there already, essentially. So that's the scary bit, and I'm hoping that I've just got to leave it at that one slide and move on a bit to actually think about what do we need to do. I want to focus down on the UK specifically because we are in the UK and we're all part of that. We all contribute to that system. It's very tempting, of course, to debate what China should do or the US should do, but we're not there and we are part of the UK environment. So let's look at what we can do here in the UK. So a few numbers. I've tried to keep the numbers quite limited on these charts, but this is the level of climate pollution that a typical person in the UK causes compared to the world average now. So it's almost double essentially. Now, it's pretty clear again from the science to put us onto a path that gets us onto a safe climate. You kind of need to be on track to get something like 2.5 by 2030. Now, there's lots of discussion, and of course, if you're a politician, you try and get as far away from this as possible, and you make your target as big as you make the amount you have to go down as little as possible. But I would argue personally that morally, as a relatively wealthy country, we shouldn't be aiming to pollute more than the rest of the world. So for me personally, I would say the ambition should be to get to that world average or better. So really, what does that look like? It looks like a 70% reduction in 7 years. And then you have to keep on reducing it beyond that, but that gets you onto the right track. So that's huge, but it is achievable because we know how to do it. It's a question of will and a question of getting the right people doing the right things, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But before I do that, I would like to go back to the Mentimeter poll. See if it works. Yes, and if you can click the arrow to go to the next one. Oh, yes, it's good. So, I'd like to ask you again, for those who did it before, to get out your phones, and it should now appear on your screen magically, if you've still got the browser open. If you haven't, the details are at the top of the slide again. And really just to think about what are the main causes of climate change. Now, I'm thinking again about a typical person in the UK, and when I say a main cause, imagine it's like more than 10%, and you can tick as many of these as you want. I've just tried to list out some of the different things. Again, I always like this bit, get to see what everyone thinks. Okay, some people are probably still typing it in. I love how knowledgeable this group is. So I think really what this is saying is as a group, we kind of recognize that there's a lot of impact across all of these. It's interesting, the bottom right actually hasn't got very much given it's got government in there. So looking at these, and if we take a kind of big impact to be more than 10% of what the UK does, press enter. If that's all right, thank you. I did the wrong thing with my thing. Right, okay, all it makes is ticks come up, actually. I could have said that. So essentially, the answer is actually all of these to some extent. And I think actually as a kind of wisdom of crowds exercise, you're kind of getting there, the idea that actually there's a lot here. So the emissions that we cause in the UK are spread across a lot of different things. And so we have to kind of take action on everything. So would you be able to flick back to the slides? Sure, thank you. Perfect. So this is how it breaks down. I haven't put the numbers on here, but the pie chart is sized correctly to the proportion that's in each of them. And I'll just run through it, and I can't do this without turning around a little bit. So first of all, kind of national services, so things like hospitals, waste management, military, the stuff the government runs directly. Then you've got electricity supply, so obviously it comes from kind of mostly gas power stations, and of course some renewable sources as well that don't create much climate change. Then you've got the food that we all eat. Meat and dairy is a really big part of that food chunk. Then products, there's a lot that sits within products. If you think things like kind of technology, equipment, clothes, furniture, there's endless product categories. And this is here because there's energy used to obviously extract the raw materials for products, to create the product in a factory, to ship the product, and so on. Next, flights on there. Flights obviously burning fuel, and there's also an effect from the fact they're flying high in the atmosphere as well. Heating our homes, I mean, this is actually why we're here for this topic. So it's another important part of this, and combined with electricity, which is obviously another way in which we use energy in our homes, is a sizable chunk and an important part of this problem. Where do we get up to? Personal services. So this includes things like your investments. So it could, when you have pensions, they could be invested in oil companies or in companies that are not trying to add more climate change into the world. But it also includes the energy use and power from things like hotels, restaurants, other shops where essentially you're not buying a product directly. And lastly, and probably one of the more obvious ones, personal vehicles. So obviously the kind of diesel and petrol that goes into the cars. I was a bit annoyed when I drew this because it looks like I've just made them all the same size, but this is actually based on the numbers that are there. They are all slightly different, but they are all important, which is quite interesting. The other thing that I think I kind of draw out from this is when you look at what's going on here, there's about 20% of the emissions that are mostly controlled by government, and to some extent council as well, although probably a lesser extent. Arguably electricity also has a reasonable amount of individual control as well. And then the remaining about 80% actually mostly comes from the individual choices. Now, again, some things you can't choose, some things are unavoidable. A lot of that does have some choice. So, bar a few essentials, we can each choose how we spend our money, whether to buy different products. We can think about where to go on holiday and how to get there. In a supermarket, we choose what to buy. When we're looking at our home, and hopefully we'll get some great tips from the next session. When we're looking at our home, we look at actually how we kind of manage our energy around our home. Whether to go by car places if we've got the option of public transport and so on. So there's various choices that we actually all make. And at this point, maybe I'll say, so one of the things that me and my family have been doing is looking, about 3 years ago, we looked at all aspects of our lifestyle. We literally went around all of these and go, actually, what if we try and make it as small as possible? You can get this really tiny. If you know the things you're looking for, this can come right down to actually a very small amount of climate change that you actually cause as an individual with no real impact on your happiness or lifestyle. In fact, I'm actually a lot happier than before I made the changes, which is really interesting. And I can talk about that a bit more afterwards if you want. But maybe we can flick back over then to the Mentimeter, the second one, if that's all right, Yasha. Yes, lovely. So you're going to have to type in a new code. So if you've probably been kicked out of the original one, or maybe you have to end it. And then there's a join another presentation button, hopefully. And if you click that, you'll be prompted to put in another number. Sorry if you get stuck. I can't see what you can see on your phones. But the code is, again, at the top there. So 78452 in this case. And again, you just got the kind of a couple of small words, just really to where is your head at around what the government needs to do urgently. And on the slide after this, I'll ask you what individuals need to do, so that's coming up. So this one's about government. Again, you're a very knowledgeable group. Okay, I'm sure a few more will probably come in. Hopefully it'll stop jumping in a minute so we can have a good read. I mean, I would certainly agree with everything I've read so far on there as well. There's a lot that the government can do. And again, I think we kind of know that. And I guess the link that we have to the government, while we don't control exactly what they do, we do have some link with our voting and with our lobbying and how we kind of influence and use our voices to make some of this stuff happen. I'd like, if you can, Yasha, just to move on to the next one on here. So if you just use the arrow. So again, same question, but this time about individuals. So you obviously saw on the previous slide where some of the emissions come from. Again, it'd be really interesting to see your thoughts on this. It should appear on your phones, hopefully by itself. All being well. Join XR. Someone's a very quick typer out there. There's more, and Join XR comes up very fast. Less. Oh, I don't know if that was a mistype, but I quite like the word just less actually on there. That's lovely. Lifestyle change, buy second hand. Go vegan, prepare, yeah. So again, I think I'm going to put up some thoughts in a minute about kind of what I think the main things are, looking at what everyone's talking about and how I kind of see some of the big things. But again, I think it shows that certainly as a group, we kind of know. All the right stuff is there. So thank you. That's very, very interesting to read. So I'm almost redundant, but I will show the next slide anyway. But essentially, I'm going to repeat a lot of what's on there. Could you go to the presentation, if that's all right? Thank you very much. So this is going to be in the form of a table, and I did a run through with my wife of this presentation a couple of days ago. She was like, "Oh, why did you do a table? That's so boring." So I'm really sorry. But what I wanted to try and do is capture on one slide all of the big things, because often when you talk about climate change, it's so confusing. When you read it in the media, it will zoom into one little narrow area of it, and it's so hard to get this big picture of actually what's needed. So what I've done is try to organise it against the sort of categories we were just talking about on the left-hand side, and I've got two columns. I've got the things that the majority of people, and again, I'm thinking about the UK here, but it also works internationally as well, but the majority of people have to do. And then I've got the majority of the people have to vote for a government that does, essentially, on the right-hand side. So very briefly, I better get to the right thing to say actually, right, and saying the right stuff. So very briefly, on buying products, we saw the word less, and I think that captures it very nicely. Amount of product being bought going up and up. I've put building work on there. Building work can be low emission, but mostly it isn't. Mostly it uses materials that are actually very high emission. So flying for individuals, again, it's thinking about kind of where you go. Holidaying closer to home. If you fly for work, actually controlling that as much as you can. It's hard for governments in this area, I think, but certainly not increasing airport capacity and reducing it would be a good step. Food, I mentioned before about meat and dairy. I mean, this is about half of the emissions in the food category itself, so it's really a big part of that. And certainly London is almost now a majority of people who don't say they're meat eaters when you look at the survey data. So people are moving away from calling themselves and thinking themselves as meat eaters, but actually it needs to go a bit further and a bit faster. And red meat in particular here is important. I've put increasing natural forests and peatland in the UK under food. And the reason I've done this is because when we choose to eat meat, it takes up a vast amount of land to do that farming. So the lovely side effect of moving to a largely or a very low meat and dairy diet is you actually open up tracts of land that can be used to create nature-rich areas as well. So it has that other benefit here. There's a lot you can do in home heating and electric that you're going to hear in the next talk, so I won't dwell on this too far, but there's one aspect which is around providers, and actually some providers have a better impact on the climate than others. It's not the panacea, it won't remove all of your impact from your energy use, but it does help. And then there's a whole host of things you can do around thinking about your energy use, your insulation, and so on. I've just touched on a few pieces there. The government can, of course, really help here by subsidising a lot of this. Driving is kind of obvious, using public transport, but also when it comes to cars, and there are people who need cars, low impact cars, so electric, small, and preferably car share is also good. And the government, of course, can support all of this. Services, pensions and investments is a really interesting area. If you have pensions and investments, that's something that can be decarbonised. And then I put on here international aid, which obviously is not quite touching on the UK's direct emissions, but actually there's a lot of support that the UK can do. You can do as individuals and you can do as government if you're lucky enough to have some money left over to actually be able to do that, to actually donate. And certainly we wouldn't want to see the government, funding gas power stations in other countries, for example. That's not a good thing. This is all the stuff focusing on 2030. This is really short-term things that can be done quickly. There's a whole host of longer-term things around kind of technologies, really changing the practices that need to come in to keep on reducing the emissions longer term as well. So I'm almost at the end. I want to think a bit about this question here, which I've thought about a lot over the last few years, which is, can governments lead these changes? So when we look before at actually who controls the different parts of the emissions, the government only controlled that kind of 20%-ish bit in the top corner. And there is a lot the government needs to do, as well, as we saw on the previous slide. But what I would argue is that actually, because most of the emissions come from the choices that individuals make, actually it's kind of down to individuals largely to drive this forward. And I think it's very difficult for a government to come in and say to a population, I'm going to stop you eating meat against your will. I'm going to stop you flying against your will. I'm going to stop you driving against your will. I'm not sure that government's going to get voted for. So I struggle to see, while the government has an important role, how they can be really leading and driving this when people actually have the most control over the majority of the emissions here. But if the majority of the public get on board with the changes, actually then the government has a real mandate to bring the rest along. So I don't think this has to be perfection, right? It's not that every single person would need to do these things, but I think a majority or a sizable minority would need to do it to bring actually the rest along with them. So I'm going to wrap up a little bit and think a bit about actually what if this happens, because we started with saying actually there's a lot of bad stuff that's going to happen if we don't do it, but what if we do it? And what's kind of interesting here is it's a really, really positive thing if we do it as a society. So just thinking about kind of us in London, I'm assuming everyone here is local. So, you know, fewer vehicles, fewer industries, you'd see a real improvement in air quality. So the air would be a lot nicer. Our homes, and we'll come onto this, I'm sure, would be a lot more comfortable and affordable. Again, it's going to be a lot quieter in urban areas with this sort of future. For those who remember the first days of the pandemic and hearing birds song walking down the street, distant memory now, right? But it was there. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that a lot of these things make people more active. So focusing more locally, focusing on more active transport and so on. And that has health benefits. I mentioned already that eating less meat and dairy opens up farmland, and it would mean that we would have access to much bigger, much more interesting wild areas within kind of a short travel distance from London. And the last thing is, and it's a subtle one, but I think quite important, if you have some disposable income and you stop focusing on buying products, what do you spend your money on? And actually the thing that's low carbon that you can spend your money on is things like arts, culture, and sport. It's the really good people-focused things. The things actually that probably most people would like to have a job in, the stuff that people do because they love, the stuff they do because it's inspiring and interesting, actually that would be the focus of spending in this new economy. So just to kind of conclude, I think kind of climate change really forces us to look at what we do, but it really could be quite a positive benefit to make these changes. And I suspect seeing that list on the previous slide is a bit scary. And as I mentioned, I kind of made a lot of these changes with my family a few years ago, and it was scary at the start to realize what was needed. But actually living in that way is really, really positive. And I don't know if any of you saw the posters out the front there, just at the side, but this was an art project my wife did, talking to other people who are already doing pretty much all the stuff that we talked about on that slide before, and their experiences of it and sharing their thoughts on it. And I would suggest if you get a time at the end, just go and have a look at that if you haven't already. Because people are, of course, worried about climate change, but they're not saying their life is miserable, because on the whole, it's actually really good. So really, I think just to kind of conclude then, I think that as a species, humanity is at a bit of a crossroads, and we've got a bit of a choice about which path we take, and one's a very negative path, and one's actually quite a positive path. And I would say that while it's tempting to delaying, unfortunately at this point, is the same as accepting the negative path. So I think I'll just kind of finish with that and wrap up and ask whether you've got any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Excellent. We're going to go to questions, and then we've got another very brief presentation or speech by our local MP, who's over in the corner. So the government are here. This is useful. Not yet. No. Okay. But you're part of the process. Yeah. Yash is going to go around with the mic. So if you've got questions, can you please give your name and speak clearly so the people who are being recorded and watching this on YouTube at home can hear, and everyone else in the audience can hear as well. So there's been a lot that's been raised by Jeremy. and we've got a lot to come on to in the next three sessions. But people have got questions now. Let's go for it. It's just whatever we've got from the first one over there.
Hi. The part I'm interested most is in your experience of the difference that you chose to have at home. When you said, you're paying attention to making sure your impact is as small as possible. I'd love to hear some of that,
so
in practical details.
Are you thinking about home energy use specifically?
All
all aspects of lifestyle?
Yeah,
okay.
I'm interested.
That's fine. I can share a bit more about that. So first of all, maybe a bit of context. So I have a couple of small kids. How old are they now? 4 and 6. So we've dragged them along for this journey with us, kind of unknowingly. What we did is we measured our footprint. I guess that's the place to start. So we did a tool to look at our footprint. There is one on this site as well if you want to use this, or there's others out there. But that's really helpful to know kind of where to focus. There were some things. So first of all, we did used to fly a little bit, and that stopped. And actually, that's been really interesting because we've ended up having holidays a lot more local, and they've been a lot nicer. Kind of exploring our local area and kind of getting around the UK and really getting to know it. So that's been a really positive thing. Switching away from meat and dairy on the whole, we still have it occasionally, special occasions, Christmas and so on, but on the whole we don't. That's a real thing about just learning to cook a different way, learning to kind of make different meals. It's almost like relearning from the start when I was a student and having to make these awful meals in my student accommodation. And it felt a bit like that to start with, but after a little while, it just becomes kind of second nature, I guess. Things around the home and energy use. I mean, there's a lot of kind of reasonably cheap things you can do around your house to bring down your energy use. And we kind of went through the list of everything that we could afford. Now our home is not like incredibly insulated and perfect because it's a bit of old house. So there's only so far you can go with solid walls, but it's significantly better. And if I'm really honest, we wear 2 or 3 jumpers in the house when we're working there and during the day, but we're warm. So we just wear more clothes, have the thermostat a bit lower, and we've got it a lot better insulated. So it was quite practical, quite low impact. The other sort of unintended consequences are switching away from spending on products, spending on holidays further afield. We actually had a bit more money, so we moved to working part-time. So now we have more time. So that's lovely. And I recognise that's not an option for everybody, and we're in a very lucky position to be able to do that, but we were in a position to do that we weren't before. So it has these kind of knock-on impacts, and that's how we've felt it. We should talk about it afterwards. I can share a bit more with you.
Thank you. Question over there. Give your name and your question. Thank you.
Hi. Excuse me. Hello, I'm Sebastian. I was interested in you saying that construction can be very high carbon. A lot of people here tonight are interested in insulating and improving their homes' efficiency. How can we do that in a low carbon way? Thank you. Okay.
So I'm first of all going to say I'm probably not the expert to talk to you on exactly how you should do it, but very broadly, so I guess I would say first of all, if you're doing building work purely for the benefit of improving your insulation, it's probably a good thing no matter what materials you're using, I would imagine, right? But building work often is done for other reasons as well, like increasing your space and so on. So that's when it starts to become a bit more critical. So materials like concrete and insulation material made with kind of modern materials are all quite carbon intensive to produce. The alternative, and I'm no expert on this, but the alternative is to often use natural materials, so things like woods and straw and other kind of materials that are made with natural plant materials rather than artificial. And the reason that's better is because when the plants are growing, they're taking the carbon out of the atmosphere, and then you're essentially storing it in your house. So it's technically possible to build a house and take carbon out of the atmosphere in the process as a whole. But it's a very specialist area, and I don't want to go down the road of giving any advice, but that's the general concept, I guess, for how you would go about it.
Okay, we do have some of the seminars coming up is a lot of specialists about retrofitting and building using low carbon methods as much as possible. You can't avoid it completely, but there are ways that if you do certain things, you can overall save on the carbon footprint. So we've got architects coming. Which night is it? It's probably the Velodrome event. Yeah, the Velodrome event is architects who will be able to work through some of the technicalities around that whole process. Okay, what other questions? Yes. Yeah, sure, if you could go down, it'd be lovely.
Hi, my name is Marie Noël. I just wonder if you have any idea or if there has been any work about the affordability of change for climate change, because I'm aware that if you have resources, you are more able to have time to reflect and to make change in general. So I don't know if there has been any work on that.
Yeah, affordability. So there's a lot on this, right? Because governments are very interested in the money side of all of this. I guess I would say really, really big picture for a second. At a global level, letting climate change happen and trying to mitigate the effects of it by just adapting is much more costly than fixing climate change before it gets worse, right? So at a global level, that's definitely true and has been proven a lot of times. What becomes a lot more complicated is when you look at it in very specific detail about the sorts of steps that I put on there. I think when, for individuals, certain things are going to be affordable and not affordable. In general, if you're somebody who hasn't got a great deal of money and disposable income, your carbon footprint's probably not going to be that high to start with, is the first thing to be aware of. So we kind of saw how, you know, products and travel and lifestyle, and the more money you have, the more of that you do, essentially, and so your footprint rises as well. So the people with the least money probably have the least to reduce because they're starting from the lowest point. So when I'm kind of suggesting these changes and I'm saying the majority of people, actually it's mostly the people who have some discretionary income and actually can afford to make those changes. For a lot of the areas though, and I picked up on some of them, you know, there is a role for government to subsidise and to support it because it isn't affordable for people to make all of those changes by themselves. And again, in a lot of cases, that's got a good return from a government point of view. It's a good investment, it generates jobs. Think about something like supporting insulation, it generates a large number of jobs. Renewable energy is the same. So these are reasonable like investment choices from a government, and for individuals it depends a lot on your circumstance. I probably haven't exactly answered your question, but let's have a chat afterwards if you want a bit more about that.
Could I invite Helen up? If possible, we have Helen Hayes, our local MP, who'd like to kind of give the government or potential government's view as an alternative.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks very much, Giles, and thank you to the Herne Hill Forum for organising this evening. I should first of all give my apologies for being late. I was voting against the government's disastrous retained EU law bill, which I think many constituents have been in touch with me about, and probably some of you who are here this evening as well, which I think, if anything, increases the risk to our environment because it is throwing away literally thousands of laws made in collaboration with the European Union without any plan to replace them and without even actually at this stage any documentation of exactly what they are or how many they are. So sorry to be joining you a little bit late. I'm really glad to see this initiative. As Jeremy was saying, we can't afford to wait any longer on climate change, and I'm going to just say a little bit about some of the things that we do need from the government and why this is part of such an important, bigger agenda. But while we don't have the action and the leadership from the government, what we do have is our own individual resources, and to be running a series of events that are really about equipping people to do what we can as individuals right now, I think is really important practical action that we really need to be taking. the importance of increasing the energy efficiency of our homes is really well documented. We know that, I think, Jeremy, I'm sure will correct me, but I think the statistic that we always used to use was that 85% of the homes that will exist 100 years from now are already built. So if we want to reduce our energy consumption, we have to focus on the homes that exist already. It is, by the way, a separate scandal that for the last 13 years we've been continuing to build new homes that will need to be retrofitted themselves, because the government in 2010 threw out of the window a whole bunch of initiatives and programmes that were designed to drive up the energy efficiency of new homes. So that should have been much, much better. But we can't ignore the question of buildings that already exist if we want to decarbonise our economy. I sit in Parliament on the Environmental Audit Committee, which has the job of scrutinising all government decision-making for its impact on the environment and climate change, and we run a series of inquiries throughout the year. We've just recently published a new report on energy security, and so that committee is a cross-party committee. It has a majority of Conservative MPs on the committee. It's our job to really look at the evidence and draw conclusions based on the evidence in a rigorous way. That report calls for a national war effort on reducing the energy consumption in our homes. It documents the urgency of that issue, and it is calling urgently for more action from the government. We really need a house-by-house, street-by-street programme in every single community up and down the country. And I should say that as the Labour Party, we have that commitment. We have a commitment to insulate 20 million homes in the next Parliament, should we be elected to government. And I very much hope that that will be the case. But as I said at the beginning, in the meantime, we have our own resources. Our councils are doing what they can. We, Southwark Council, where we are this evening, have where they are able to do so, where they have the resources to do so, they are retrofitting council homes. And this agenda also speaks to the crisis that we have of fuel poverty and poverty in general at the moment. It is so hard to make ends meet, and what I'm seeing in my inbox, in my caseload at the moment, is an increase in the number of constituents getting in touch because their homes are damp and mouldy, and that's really not helped at all by people not being able to afford to heat their homes properly. So we know that damp and mould is a problem in lots of housing, and it's a problem for people's health, and it's a very difficult problem to deal with sometimes in existing buildings, but it is helped greatly by being able to keep the ambient temperature in your home up at a kind of reasonable level. And this winter what we're seeing is people really not being able to afford to do that, and mould and damp getting much, much worse as a consequence of it, with all of the terrible consequences that has for people's health. So this is an issue that affects every part of our community in different ways, and but this initiative, which is specifically about empowering people who have the resources to do so, who own their own homes, who want to make a difference themselves, is really important. A final just word of encouragement. So on the Environmental Audit Committee, as part of this inquiry, we also had evidence on solar power. And domestic solar has increased until the government abandoned the feed-in tariff, was increasing really, really dramatically all across the country. And there were lots of people who would say, well, it doesn't make that much difference. You know, me putting a solar panel on my home in the context of the enormous challenge of climate change isn't going to make that much difference. Domestic solar now delivers the same amount of electricity as a nuclear power station all across the country. So together, individuals, the collective impact of individual action really can make a very powerful difference. And as I say, at the moment, it's one of the main things that we have. So you have all of my encouragement with this work, which I think is really important and a great initiative from Herne Hill Forum. Thank you.